What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my thoughts on achievement design. As somebody who 100%s a lot of games, it comes up every here and there, but in particular, the reason I'm making this video is about 6 weeks back or so, I sat down for an interview with Todd Howard over at Bethesda Game Studios, and at the end of that interview, he actually had some questions for me talking about achievements in general. A lot of people picked up on that part of the interview, and in incredibly timely fashion, I decided to finally get around to circling back and elaborating a bit. Because while that conversation was a great conversation, I only had a limited time to work with and wasn't really expecting anyone to have a lot of questions for me personally either, and so I figured later on I could make a video like this elaborating a bit, which is obviously what we are here to do. So let's talk about achievements a little more generally first. So achievements are interesting in the sense that I enjoy going after them, believe it or not, but at the very same time I also don't believe that they are, really necessary as a component to a video game in any way. I also don't think they are all that important in comparison to the overall experience, and I look at them as just like a fun extra thing to do to just kind of remind me that I've done everything there is to do, and we'll talk about that note specifically here in just a moment. That, however, is just a tiny little fraction of what they mean to me personally, and if you ask other people what they mean to them, you would obviously get different answers. I know there are people who don't like them at all, like to the point of being actively against them. I know some people don't care about them one way or another. I know other people will only bother to get them for games they really loved and cared about. And I know, as I say this, you're probably sitting there thinking, yes, Mortem, people feel differently about different things. That's how opinions work. Congratulations on figuring that out at the ripe old age of 32. To which I would like to say, whoa there, weirdly aggressive. The reason I'm bringing out that particular point is actually that it's important to remember not only the kind of game you are making in relation to the type of achievements it winds up having, but who you are expecting to go after them. Who is the audience for the thing you are doing is always something to keep in mind. Because A, you are never going to please everyone, it's just not going to happen. And B, I think the type of game you are making and your expected audience can inform a little bit at least of what is probably going to make a more satisfying experience in terms of not only the game, but also the achievements and how that feels. And so, going from there, the next thing I'd like to talk about is actually the stuff I hate in achievements. There are a handful of things when it comes to achievements, including, ironically, with Starfield, they just recently added one that's horrible, which is what that interview with Todd Howard kind of alluded to, but the things that I genuinely hate when it comes to achievements. Probably the number one when it comes to that is multiplayer achievements in a primarily single-player game. Those always suck, not only because I don't really want to play multiplayer in a primarily single-player title, and even if it has like co-op and multiplayer options, that's fine, but I don't think adding achievements for it is generally ever a good thing, even if they aren't necessarily offensive in and of themselves. And the reason for that is purely because what tends to happen with these multiplayer modes in these types of games is it gets shut down. And a lot of studios do not always follow that up by making the multiplayer achievements that were there obtainable. Just to give you a couple of examples, recently even, of the games I've been reviewing. The original Shadow of Mordor title with the Nemesis system and everything, that game had a multiplayer system, and when it got shut down, they actually went and adjusted the achievement so they would still be attainable. That was nice, and is probably the best case scenario in that situation, because what happens more often than not is they don't change anything, and if it gets shut down, it's just either no longer available or it's a gigantic hassle. Or even further still, the multiplayer might not get shut down, but it might just be so dead that the achievement is very hard to obtain as a result of that. So for a variety of reasons, I really just don't like those types of achievements very broadly. To take it one step farther, I mentioned an achievement with Starfield that was recently added that is also not fun. And this is actually their achievement called They Are Not Toys, which on the surface of it is just a collectible achievement, which aren't always in and of themselves terrible or anything, and if anything, and sometimes can be a commentary on the game itself. No, the problem with this achievement is actually that it is an RNG-based collectible achievement. Collectible achievements in and of themselves, fine. However, making those collectibles a purely RNG thing that you're essentially just going to see people force grind via save points, etc., it just turns into people spending like 20 to 30 hours just loading or forcibly resetting a dungeon or something to get to the end of it to see if it spawns, that kind of thing. Which is exactly what you have to do with an achievement like this. Now you compare that to collectibles with set locations where these things are fine, and it's just a very different experience. I don't in general like achievements that are heavily RNG based like this, even beyond the context of this as a collectible, which in and of itself isn't super fun. But the reason I don't like it in particular is mostly just because all it is going to do is see people's saves coming and basically forcing the RNG to do what they want it to do, and it just kind of gets a little boring after a while, to be honest. I suppose there are people who may accidentally kind of wander into stuff like this, which can make for some funny moments or something like that, but very broadly, this kind of stuff just isn't very fun to me. But then there's another type of achievement, or rather set of achievements I don't exactly love, and they are achievements that do not fully represent what a game is about. I've talked about this here and there, but sometimes the achievement list for a game is not really the game, or it just doesn't accurately represent all the content. Because one of the enjoyable things about this type of system as a whole is being able to go like, I got all the achievements, I've seen all the game, hooray, I can move on, or whatever else. Some games, however, have achievements that are easily obtainable but don't give you the full picture. One of the really good examples of this, I think, is actually a CRPG called Underrail. Underrail is a fantastic little game. I'm not going to explain it here. I've got an older review if you want to hear more about it, but I mention it in this context because Underrail achievements are not terribly difficult to get for the most part, and that is because the vast majority of the achievements for that game are combat achievements, like for killing things with various types of weapons or performing certain actions in combat, that kind of thing. And Underrail is like this fantastic experience that has some fantastic side content and ways to approach the game via your builds and everything, and like hardly any of that is represented via the achievement list, and that feels underwhelming as a result. And it makes for a situation where it's like, yeah, you might have all the achievements, but did you really see all of the game? And I don't think that's fun, personally. And then there's actually one more thing I wanted to mention in this section, which is Crimson Desert specifically. And I mentioned this game specifically because I've never seen a game handle it quite like this, actually. I think Crimson Desert has a deeply unfun achievement list. And the reason for that is not actually the achievements or what you have to do for the achievements themselves. I think that's fine. It's that in order to get the achievements for Crimson Desert, you have to collect like 140 of these sealed artifacts, which then shows you the challenge associated with that artifact that you need to do to open it. All of those challenges and tasks and stuff, alongside a handful of other activities, are then separated out into challenges. Completing all of those is what gives you the achievements for Crimson Desert. So what they've actually done is made it to where they've hidden the vast majority of the achievements behind a giant collectible hunt that you can't even start until you've collected them. Meaning that progress on this stuff, for the most part, is not retroactive. Meaning that if you don't immediately go get all of these sealed artifacts as early as possible, you're going to set yourself up into a situation where you may well have to do things that are annoying over and over again in the late game, where that can actually be more difficult. Like, for instance, as it currently stands, enemies and stuff are gone once you kill them. They don't really respawn, which can make certain achievements with specific weapons, like utilizing the stationary cannons, which are only in so many places, really, really difficult because the game never told you anything about it because you didn't get the artifact in time. And it just creates this situation where the whole process of trying to get these achievements is deeply unfun. And again, I've never seen another game do that, so hard to call it anything in particular, I guess, but there it is for you. Now, those are just a handful of things that I really don't enjoy personally, but I do have some more stuff to say about this generally, starting with the type of game you happen to be playing versus the difficulty of the achievements associated with it. So what I mean by this is like difficulty related achievements and how they factor into the overall experience. To give a quick example, one of my proudest gaming accomplishments is not something that comes with an achievement, at least in the game I did it in, and that is the ultimate for Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire. This was like a big challenge put together by the developers of Obsidian with all these special rules and everything and hidden challenges from the main menu that you can enable people, and as a result, very few people have ever done that. And I'm here to tell you that challenge does not need an achievement associated with it. It's a little way too much for a game that otherwise does not ask that of you. I look at that the same way I look at like challenge runs for Skyrim or any other Bethesda game, really, where people are making a set of arbitrary rules that they are imposing on themselves to make an experience that is unique and otherwise memorable, that doesn't really have anything else to do with the rest of it. And that's totally fine. Those things can exist on their own, and I don't think they need achievements associated with them because, and this is probably one of the more important things I have to say, I don't think an achievement list needs to be so all-encompassing that like people are somehow prohibited from making their own fun with the game. And I think you have to remember that people are always going to do what they're going to do and play games in different ways that you may not think of, and you don't necessarily need to account for those. It's not a big deal. If it becomes like a big thing, you may want to add an achievement in there just to acknowledge it for funsies. But with that said, when it comes to talking about difficulty-related achievements, I think it really does come down to the game and the intended audience. Like, for instance, all sorts of Souls-like types of games where the difficulty is often the point. And while we are seeing more and more Souls-like games incorporate a variety of different difficulty options to tailor that experience for people, which is something I'm very much a fan of, I think giving people more options to play their games is great. However, the point of a Souls-like game is often the challenge associated with the game. That's much more of a prevalent feature there than it is in other genres and the like. And so if any game is going to have a difficulty achievement, I think those types of games are the ones to do it. And I've actually seen one title, I think it was Steel Rising, which has difficulty options but turns the achievements off if you play below the like normal intended difficulty. And so while one of the things that I talked about in that interview with Todd Howard was how, something taking a lot of time isn't necessarily an enjoyable experience, and that kind of relates back to this as well, because while there are plenty of games that could simply add a difficulty achievement and increase the time it would take to play that game and accomplish that thing, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's an enjoyable experience for people because of the intended audience thing that I've been talking about. So Souls-like's intended audience are the people that are going to sign up for that kind of thing, because oftentimes those games are more based around skill difficulty, or the old adage of get good, if you will, either by literally getting better at the game or, becoming so knowledgeable of it that you find ways to break it that allow you to get past those moments. And that's also okay. A lot of games, however, are not that. And because I've mentioned Todd Howard here, I think Bethesda's games are actually a really great example of this, in the sense that, yes, could you add a difficulty achievement and make that take longer? Sure. Are Bethesda RPGs the type of games that I think should do that? Probably not. Mostly because the audience that plays those games isn't really after that like hardcore difficulty. They're more so after, I think, the RPG experience of it and exploring, getting lost in the world, seeing all these different stories and, the environmental storytelling that they're well known for, that kind of thing. So in the case of Bethesda in particular, and knowing the type of people who play their games the most, I think in their case, achievements that are more tailored toward exactly that, the exploration and seeing all of the content on offer, the different faction quests, things that embrace all the little details that they get into, and how that builds the world around them, and the stuff that really ropes people in as a result, is really the kind of things that they should probably focus on for an achievement list. And without going on and on about it forever, I think with those examples you'll probably see what I'm talking about. Mainly just that, to reiterate, I think the type of game that is being made needs to keep that in mind, and who is most likely to play this type of game and what type of experience is that intended to be. The achievement list should ideally tailor itself to whatever that is, because that is what is going to feel the most rewarding to the people playing that particular game, which I think is, the more important bit here. And then in the sort of last section I want to talk about here, I have things like the miscellaneous stuff, collectibles, really tedious achievements, multiple playthrough type stuff, that kind of thing. Let's talk about all of that. So first and foremost, I think it should be kept in mind how tedious something is going to be, and whether or not the payoff at the end of that tedious thing is worth it or not. To give a very recent example of this, we have Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2. there is an achievement for that game that in order to get it, you are going to have to beat that game 6 times in a row. Thankfully, it's not terribly long if you are just zooming through it at that point, but unfortunately, I will say that the clans represented in Bloodlines 2, while they certainly do play a little different, the story does not change so much because of this. As a result, that winds up being a meaningful experience. And because all of the skills and abilities are available to all of the clans anyway, what you're left with is a lot of playthroughs that don't really feel all that much different from each other. And so while I can see why they wanted to include this, it ultimately just doesn't add enough to, I think, justify its existence as an achievement. It's mostly just tedious. That is not fun, it's boring. Especially when you had to sit through all the Fabian sections, but that's a whole separate thing. And that is exactly the kind of thing people should keep in mind when we are talking about collectible achievements. Right this very second, I'm playing through Alan Wake, which is an older title that I wanted to mention specifically here because it has a bizarre amount of collectibles. Some of those collectibles are more worthwhile than others because collecting them directly sort of feeds into everything else going on. Adds background to the sort of the horror type experience here where you're trying to get to the bottom of everything going on, and the collectibles that feed into that knowledge and gameplay loop make a lot of sense. Other ones don't really, like the thermoses you have to pick up for an achievement that don't seem to serve any purpose other than just being there and being a thing you can pick up. I don't think stuff like that really matters. So I would say if you're going to have really big, annoying collectible achievements, they either need to feed into the gameplay experience in some way, or the reward for getting all of them better be really good and worth your time. But I think if we're talking about collectibles and the like, that's a natural place to talk about things that are missable and things that might require multiple playthroughs as well. So this is another situation where I think it is really game dependent. Sometimes things being really missable or easy to overlook is annoying because it might not necessarily be a game that is really conducive to multiple playthroughs. On the flip side, I also think there are games where you can get everything in one go, but it might have made more sense to space it out a little bit due to, say, like a big branching narrative, etc. Because in either case, what usually happens, especially if the game has a free save system that allows you to simply reload and pick the other option or whatever else gets you to that missable thing, really all you're doing is creating a situation where people are just going to reload their way through it. But games where multiple playthroughs will give you like drastically different outcomes and achievements for exploring those different options can be fun, provided that the replayability makes sense to apply there. So missable things can be annoying, and I think it's really just a case of, like, again, keep in mind the type of game you are making and who is this game for. But beyond those, I would say bigger picture type of things, I will say there's something to be said for making achievements for small little things that can happen in the moment that are reactives to something you may have done without even realizing it's an achievement. Stuff like that can be fun. For instance, in one of my favorite games, Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, there is an achievement you can get very early in the game on accident if you interact with a pillar from the wrong side, because it then rolls over and hits you. And if that happens, you'll proc an achievement called Death by Column, and I actually got that one the, let's say, intended way, and I got a pretty big laugh out of it. But moments like that can capture something, rewarding or funny, all on its own, are also really enjoyable. And I think when it comes to the process of getting achievements and things like that, that's kind of where my thoughts lay pretty generally. But if you have any more questions, feel free to ask them down in the comments section below, because that is going to do it for today's video, which certainly means to like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.